Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into something I think you're really going to find interesting. It's all about body language,
Right.
but not the usual stuff you hear about, like crossed arms means you're closed off.
Right.
This is about something much deeper. We're talking about how our bodies actually convey emotion through movement.
Mm.
Think about it. I'm sure you've had this experience. You watch a dancer, and even without any music or facial expressions, you just feel their emotion.
Yeah.
And there's actually some really cool research from the University of Geneva that decided to put that to the test. They wanted to see how much people could tell about someone's emotional state just by watching them move.
It's really fascinating stuff. They use professional dancers, motion capture technology, the whole works, to really try and isolate the impact of movement on how we perceive emotion.
So how do they actually go about doing that? Well, they had these dancers perform choreographed movements, specifically designed to express particular emotions. So we're talking about things like happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, the whole gamut. But here's the really interesting part. They had the dancers perform each emotion with two different levels of intensity, subtle and intense.
Oh, wow.
So it's like the difference between, say, a gentle simmer of anger versus like a full-blown outburst, right?
I see. I see.
And to make things even more interesting, they restricted the dancers' movements to a very specific space. They called it the peripersonal space, which sounds kind of technical. But basically, imagine the area you can reach without having to take a step. So no big dramatic gestures, just these small, contained movements within that personal bubble of space.
Interesting.
The researchers actually had a fancy term for it. They called it the kinesphere.
The Gaines view.
Yeah, sounds very sci-fi, doesn't it?
It does.
But it essentially just refers to that area where our bodies are most intimately connected to the world around us.
And by limiting the dancers to that space, they could really focus on those subtle, almost instinctive movements we make when we're feeling something strongly, right?
Exactly. So the big question is, did people actually pick up on those subtle cues?
Right.
Were they able to accurately read the emotions the dancers were trying to convey just from their movements? Well, that's what we're going to find out. So what did they find? Well, it turns out people were actually pretty good at recognizing certain emotions, like happiness, sadness, anger. Those they could usually pick out just from the movements, even in that limited space.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. It means those emotions, at least they seem to have like a pretty universal way of showing up in our bodies, even when we're not making big, obvious gestures.
Right. It's like our bodies are kind of giving us away, even when we're trying to be subtle.
Exactly.
And this is where it gets really interesting. There were some emotions that were much harder to tell apart. Fear and surprise, for example.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, it seems like those two emotions, they tend to share some similar qualities of movement, especially when it comes to things like speed, force, and fluidity. So, if someone reacts quickly and intensely, it might not be immediately clear if they're afraid or just surprised.
That makes sense. It's like our brains are getting all these mixed signals.
Exactly. And it makes you realize how easy it is to misinterpret someone, even when we think we're paying attention to their body language.
Absolutely. And this finding actually challenges a common assumption, the idea that there's always like a direct one-to-one relationship between a gesture and an emotion.
Right.
Because sometimes those cues overlap, even with very expressive movement.
So context is key.
Context is everything.
Now, another question the researchers wanted to explore was whether having dance experience made a difference in how well people could read the emotions. Like, you'd think someone who's trained in dance would be better at picking up on those subtle cues, right?
Yeah, you'd think so, right?
Here's the thing. It didn't seem to make a difference.
Really?
Yeah. People with dance experience were no better at reading the emotions than those without.
Wow, that's surprising. Any idea why that might be?
Well, it probably has to do with how the experiment was designed. You see, they didn't show the observers videos of the dancers. They used what are called point light displays.
Point light displays.
Yeah, basically it's like those stick figures we used to draw in school to represent movement. They just show the movement of key body parts as points of light, not the full body of the dancer.
Ah, I see.
And it seems like those point light displays, even without all the detail, they provided enough information for people to understand the basic movements and the emotions they conveyed.
So it's like those underlying movement qualities rather than specific dance knowledge are what really matter in this case.
Exactly. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is?
It really shows how much information our bodies are giving off, even in ways we might not even realize. Speaking of these subtle cues, the study also used a really interesting tool to analyze the dancer's movements. something called Laban Movement Analysis, or LMA.
LMA.
Have you ever heard of that?
I have. It's a fascinating system for describing and understanding movement.
It sounds incredibly complex.
It can be, but it's really about breaking down movement into its essential elements. So instead of just saying, oh, they move their arm like this, LMA lets us talk about the qualities of that movement. Like, was it direct or indirect? Was it bound or free-flowing? How much effort was involved? Things like that.
Okay, so it's not just about what the body is doing, but how it's doing it.
Exactly.
Like that. So how did this LMA thing play into the study? What did they find?
Yeah. Well, when they used LMA to analyze the dancers' movements, they found that certain LMA qualities were strongly linked to specific emotions.
Oh, wow. So like a direct connection between how someone was moving and what emotion they were feeling.
Pretty much. For example, anger was often associated with quick, direct, and forceful movements, very clear and very to the point.
Makes sense.
Right. While sadness tended to be expressed with more sinking, bound movements, like less free-flowing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get it.
And then happiness that was linked to more fluid, light, expansive kinds of motions.
It's like each emotion has its own unique movement signature.
It really is.
So it's not just about whether someone is waving their arms or stomping their feet. It's about the way they're doing it, the effort, the speed, the flow.
Exactly. You got to look at the whole package.
It's about looking at the whole package of movement, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes LMA so valuable. It gives us this whole vocabulary for understanding and describing those nuances we often pick up on without even realizing it.
I'm starting to see why this is so fascinating. It's like we're unlocking a whole new level of understanding how we communicate without even saying a word. But wait, there's more. The study also looked at another really cool aspect of how we perceive emotion and movement. This one I think is really cool. They created what you might call a body map of emotion. So they asked people to focus on which specific body part they noticed most when watching those dancers. And guess what? They found some pretty interesting patterns.
It's amazing, right? Like our bodies have these almost subconscious ways of emphasizing certain areas depending on what we're feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For instance, when the dancers were expressing fear, observers tended to focus more on the head.
Which makes sense if you think about it. Fear is often associated with a sense of vulnerability. And our heads, well, they hold our brains, our senses. It's where we process threats.
It's like that expression, head in your hands when you're scared.
Exactly. And then for anger, people's attention was drawn more to the arms.
Again, makes sense. Arms are often how we express aggression, even if it's just a subtle clenching of the fists.
Right. And then there's happiness. For that emotion, people tended to focus more on the pelvis.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and where more research is definitely needed. But one theory is that our movements, when we're happy, tend to be more expansive, more about connecting with the space around us. And that often originates from the hips, the core of our body.
Fascinating. So it's like we're unconsciously drawing attention to different parts of ourselves, depending on the emotion we're feeling. It's like a whole other language our bodies are speaking.
That's a great way to put it. And this body map idea, it really opens up a whole new avenue of research. Are these patterns universal, or are they shaped by our culture, our upbringing? Do different people learn to read these cues in different ways? There's so much more to explore.
So where does this all leave us? What's the takeaway from this deep dive into emotion and movement?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't underestimate the power of nonverbal communication. Our bodies are constantly expressing our emotions, whether we're conscious of it or not. And learning to read those subtle cues well, it can give us a whole new level of understanding in our interactions with others.
Absolutely. And it's not just about trying to become a human lie detector. It's about becoming more aware of how our own bodies are communicating and how we might be perceived by others.
Exactly. It's about becoming more mindful, both in how we move and how we interpret the movements of those around us.
So much to think about. Next time I'm people watching, I'll definitely be paying attention to all those subtle cues we talked about. Who knew body language could be so complex and so revealing?
Right. It's a whole world of nonverbal communication just waiting to be decoded.
And that's our deep dive for today. We've just scratched the surface of this fascinating topic, but hopefully it's given you some food for thought. The next time you're watching a dancer or even just having a conversation with a friend, pay attention to not just what they're saying, but how their bodies are moving. You might be surprised by what you discover.